not a login. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us at this first breakout session of today. In this session, we're going to be focusing on digital ethics in the public sector and ask the question if we're making headway. Be introducing our excellent panelists just in a moment, but just to introduce the topic, we're obviously aware this is the 6th annual Digital Ethics Summit at Tech UK. Awareness of digital ethics has been growing across sectors, and we're focusing more on accessibility. We're focusing more on trying to combat any biases or injustices in technology. But here we're really focusing on, for this discussion, what that means for the public sector and whether there's any specific significance for digital ethics in the public sector. And to introduce our panel, we have a great lineup of speakers. Next to me is Dr. Kevin McNeish. He's the Digital Ethics Consulting Manager at Soprasteria. Then we have Sam Nutt, who's a researcher and data ethicist at the London Office of Technology and Innovation. We have Arik Chowdhury, who is Head of Policy for Data and Digital Technologies at the Royal Society. And we also have Callum Inverarity, who is a senior researcher, at the Open Data Institute. And online, we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Michaela Omelkova, who is a data ethics advisor for the Scottish Government. So we have a great breadth of expertise with us here. So please consider questions as we go along with the discussion. My colleagues will be able to go around with a mic after. And also, if you're joining us online, it's the left-hand side of your screen. There's a Q&A button. You can get questions through there. And then one of my other colleagues will be representing your questions here in the room. So we'll get through as many as we can. But before the questions, I want to give an opportunity for each of the panelists to set up a little bit more of where they're coming from on this topic and a bit of an introduction to the work in the area. Not too long, because we want to get to people as well. But maybe we can just kick off with you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So, thank you for the introduction and having me here. One of the things that Soprasteria has been doing over the last year is really investigating what we mean by public trust and trust in the public sector. And so over the summer, we carried out a couple of surveys, one survey of over 1,000 people looking at what's meant by citizen trust and what citizens are looking for from government. And then we also carried out a series of interviews with civil servants from places like BEIS, Department of International Trade, Scottish Government, Home Office and places like that, trying to understand what the state of digital ethics was in the UK government at the moment.
Interesting. And perhaps we can go online to Michaela?
Yeah, sure. First of all, can you hear me well?
We can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
So I am Michaela, and I am, as you introduced me at the beginning, the Data Ethics Advisor for Data and Intelligence Network team at the Scottish Government. And I joined the network team this year in January to push forward the operationalisation of data ethics, particularly within the Scottish Government and within the network as much as possible. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit first about the Data and Intelligence Network itself, which it's an organisation that's been set up during the pandemic to facilitate fast data and knowledge exchange across the Scottish public and third sector organisations, such that this kind of joint inter-organisational effort will allow quality data analysis and provide evidence for decision making during that time. And now an absolute sort of cornerstone for the operations of the network and the network team was that although fast and reactive, the data exchange and analysis were to be done ethically. So this is where my work comes into the play. And in terms of the reflections and the question whether we're making headway, I believe we really are. However, it's a case of looking for better solutions with each iterations of our ethics approaches, rather than already having the final digital or data ethics framework or assessment or what have you, and actually always, as my colleague said before me, investigating what is meant by the different principles we use, whether people's views on those principles changes, what their trust really means, transparency really means, and so on. So yeah, I would probably wrap it up here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Over to you, Sam.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me as well. So I work for the London Office of Technology and Innovation, or LOTI. For those of you who, hopefully some of you have heard of us, we're a part of local government in London. So we have 25 members who are boroughs of London as well as the Mayor of London. And we work to sort of foster innovation through collaboration across our membership in London itself. Our work on data ethics and my role really emerged out of the demand and the conversations that we were having with local government, with our members. So in particular, to shout out some of the boroughs that have been leading the way on this, we've had Camden and Brent, for example, and maybe I can talk a little bit more later about specifically what they've been doing, but they really sort of got the ball rolling in London, and then sort of communicated, and we've collaborated and learned together that this is something we should be thinking about data ethics quite meaningfully if we want to do more advanced data innovation and deliver better outcomes for our residents, for Londoners. So we helped sort of create my job, luckily. It's really, I think, a good example of the value of LOTI existing in this collaborative format, in the sense that the boroughs themselves don't have the capacity to spend time and effort doing the research to understand what it is they need to be doing. They're all incredibly under-resourced, and a lot of them don't even realize it's going to be something that they need to be thinking about until it's gone wrong, which has happened, and that's pretty much why Camden and Brent are the best boroughs at it. It's because they're reacting to something. So what we're doing as a community is we're really just sort of anticipating future problems down the line, and we're quite proud of it in terms of public sector trying to get ahead of the problem through this sort of collaboration and innovation approach. So what we've done is we've set up a London data ethics service, which effectively is what I run in my job, and that involves partly hands-on working with boroughs who don't have the capacity to navigate some of these ethical dilemmas in their data projects themselves, partly organizational development so we can help develop those capacities, and then partly research, creating sort of shared resources, shared guidance, shared policy, so that we can be, as a community in London, working to the same standards. So that's a bit from my end.
Thanks, Sam. And Arik, from the Royal Society, what kind of perspective are you coming from?
Yeah, so morning everyone. So I've been in this space for several years, and at the Royal Society for a couple of years. Outside of this, I'm also a Labour Party councillor in Newham Council. I'm very interested to know how Newham rank in your order of councils that are doing well. That's good to know. At the Society, we're very interested in this from a couple of perspectives. One is our mission is to use science for the benefit of humanity, and therefore to use data and digital tech for the benefit of humanity. And ethics is important to us from that perspective in terms of making sure that useful technologies are adopted and are trusted by end users, and that users know, the public know that what their data is being used for, how it's being controlled, how it's being governed. There's lots of research by the Royal Society and others outlining that these are key things that the public care about, and if you don't have those things, you're not going to be able to take full advantage of these new technologies. My own personal perspective on top of that, and just to be a bit controversial, because I like doing that, is I'm quite skeptical actually of conversations that focus heavily on data ethics, because first of all, data is a massive topic. It covers everything, and in the public sector, again, a massive sector. It covers everything from car parking to facial recognition surveillance, and the ethical considerations for those are completely different and require all sorts of different considerations. And as in the previous conversation, what Carly Kind from the Ada Lovelace Institute was saying, we need actually to think much broader than just data protection when it comes to regulation of these technologies. And sometimes it's not possible to apply an ethical framework to policies which are unethical, or can be argued to be unethical. Take, for example, the facial recognition surveillance example. Is there a way to actually ethically surveil populations where that surveillance involves deep analysis of people's facial structures. I would be skeptical of that. However, in terms of making headway in the public sector, I think we're moving from a position of zero thinking to some thinking, and Lottie and others are making good progress on this. But hopefully, as we'll get into this discussion, I don't want to take up too much time. It would be good to think beyond ethics and think about what are we actually trying to solve objectively. Are we trying to make a better society? And if so, what needs to be considered within that? Is it how these technologies are being trained? What data is being used? Are they being trained by digital sweatshops in some other country who are not being paid well? Or are the only ethical considerations we care about user consent and public participation?
Yeah. No, thanks. And I think it's always good to question the question itself. And also this question around how we actually segment, can we apply, do you apply a framework? Can you do that to any policy that uses tech, or are there other questions that need to be answered? So hopefully we'll get a chance to dive into that some more. But firstly, over to you, Callum.
Thank you. Good morning, I think it still is. So, yes, I'm Callum. I'm from the Open Data Institute. Just very briefly, for those that don't or aren't aware of the Open Data Institute, it's a non-profit company founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadwell 10 years ago. We actually had our 10th anniversary celebration on Friday. Our mission is to work with companies and governments to create open and trustworthy data ecosystems. And as part of that, our vision is to kind of try and envisage and then realize a world in which data works for everyone. So I think this speaks quite similarly to some of the points that Arik was just making as well, actually, and then particularly around the subject of data ethics. We kind of view it as going beyond just compliance and regulation, at least as a starting point for those discussions. So we kind of view it through that lens, and while progress might be slow, then at least it's some effort towards it. So understandably or naturally, coming from the Open Data Institute, I focus more specifically on data ethics rather than the broader spectrum of digital ethics, but obviously it's a very important component of that. This is just growing in importance, and the research that we've been doing at the Open Data Institute for the past 10 years, I've only been there for one, so I can't claim ownership of all of it, but it's similarly incorporated public surveys where first we were looking into citizen trust for the use of data, and then the trust in using that data ethically, which came as a sort of second survey that we did actually in partnership with YouGov. So we've been taking some of the results or the findings from our research over these years to develop some practical tools to also operationalize data ethics. So we've seen quite a big pickup and interest in some of these products, including our data ethics canvas, which just helps individuals or organizations to think through the potential ethical implications of if they're adopting a certain technology or a new sort of process. Similarly, we have also developed a range of training courses for data ethics that we deliver to government departments and local councils as well. So I'm going to kind of keep it short there, but it's just to say that we are also seeing a take-up of this, and at least it's a start.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks all. As we get into the discussion, I was thinking maybe it would be useful to think a little bit about the kind of the journey or what your assessment is of the progress that we've seen already. And maybe if I can come to you first, Kevin, just with your experience in kind of you're obviously advising many different types of organizations on digital ethics. And if you think, I suppose the question is sort of, are we making headway? But also just to assess in the last like 5 or 10 years when digital ethics has just sort of exploded in prominence. Are you starting to see that actually being, having an impact on practices, on approaches in public sector organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yes, there is progress, absolutely. It's very interesting listening to everybody who's been speaking. I think the main progress that we've been seeing is around data ethics. And come back to Callum's point, differentiating between data and digital ethics. That yes, data is an important subsection of digital, but digital ethics considers technology more broadly. There are areas which are ethical but are not data related. So take, for example, the so-called racist soap dispenser. which if you look on YouTube, you'll find it. It was a soap dispenser where you put your hand underneath it and it'll automatically put soap into your hand if you have white skin. If you don't have white skin, it doesn't work. Now, that's not obviously a data issue to me, but it is clearly an ethical issue around the technology. And I think largely, looking back over the last 12 years or so, the introduction of GDPR made a significant difference as to how people treated questions about privacy and about data generally. And that has led to a flurry of development, things like the CDEI, the CDDO, the Data Quality Hub, the National Data Strategy. But you'll recognize data coming up over and over again, and I think that's where the focus has been. And we risk missing the bigger picture if we just focus on data. One of the things that we found, particularly in the research which I mentioned just now, is that there has become a certain level of stovepiping between sustainability efforts in the public sector and data ethics issues. So going back to your point, Arik, exactly about what we mean by ethics and how far do we extend ethics, sustainability is clearly an ethical issue. And when it comes to processing in the cloud, where's that processing being done? How's it being powered? Where's the electricity coming for that, for example? When it comes to decommissioning of hardware, what's happening to the precious metals in that hardware? Questions like that that aren't at the moment being considered part of the digital ethics landscape. And I think the second thing, and this comes back to a point that Luciano made in the earlier panel, is that the legislation, GDPR, forms a base level, if you like, and that seems to be the point at which people are aiming and saying, okay, this is where we need to be. In actual fact, we need to be going considerably above that. And in one of the surveys which I mentioned, we found that 70% of the public expect the government to do more than just meet the legal minimum requirements for GDPR. They want to do more. And that's where we move from compliance into ethics, into that going above and beyond what the basic requirement is. So I think, to come back to your question, Emily, yes, there has been progress. The progress has been great. Having spoken to companies 10 years ago and spoken to them and speaking to them now, can see a significant difference in how they're thinking about privacy and data protection issues. But there is a very long way to go still. And maybe it would be a good idea to come to you, Michaela, just for both to reflect a little bit on where you think the public sector is now and how receptive to the questions around digital ethics, but maybe also to comment on where you see the data ethics work fitting in a wider digital ethics agenda, and if that's something you and your team are thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start maybe with the last question, the kind of interaction between the digital and data ethics. And I'll speak particularly for Scottish Government because that's the landscape I know the best. So we do have kind of dedicated digital ethics team, and we just published a sort of digital ethics paper looking at the recommendations. And I think that in that aspect, we are making very good progress in thinking within the digital ethics about the interaction between the human, the technology, the environment, and kind of considering it quite holistically. Whether the data ethics and digital ethics, kind of fit together and how they work together, that is, I feel, a very complicated question, because some of the digital technologies obviously are used for harvesting data. They generate some data assets. So there is an interaction which, either you can try and generate a framework which covers both, which my personal opinion is that's not going to work, or you consider these two issues somewhat separately. And one way of looking at this is, what's the use case for this? What is this meant to be used for? So, in a nutshell, we have at the moment separate approaches to digital ethics and data ethics, but they do talk to each other. And thinking about the ways we approach it, at the heart of any ethics assessments or frameworks, you have those principles. And speaking quite generically, those principles are often going to be very similar. What's going to be somewhat different are the questions you ask to dissect the ethics out. You always ask who's going to benefit, for example, but there's going to be specific issues connected to digital technologies and specific issues connected to data, whether it's the analysis, or it's whether it's using a pre-linked data set, whatever you've got. When it comes to reflecting on the progress, I'm super new in this, so joined just in January, but even looking back at those, what was it, 11 months, I think there is progress. And I would kind of flip that question slightly. For me, one of the first things I've done was, talking to colleagues and asking that big question that Arig actually raised, what is ethics? How do people define ethics in our organization? And, it is this big concept that everyone's somewhat aware of, but everyone might have slightly different definition. And just reiterating the importance, doing communications, and appealing to people that we do. It's a bigger issue of ethical behavior everywhere. So if you don't have ethical behavior within that organization in any other aspect, it's difficult to go and raise the bar to sort of data ethics or digital ethics, because it all relies on people being able to pick up on potential ethical issues, so kind of predicting something and having the language to raise that such that people in their management line and whatnot understand it and are want to pick up on it. So I think that in this sense we are really making headway, which is not maybe going to be seen straight away by the public, but it's something where, we need to kind of clean our own house first, where we need to make sure that our colleagues understand why we're doing it, what's the importance of it, and kind of reiterating that message so that them as users can really kind of embrace the approaches we are starting to put in place, so that we can derive the maximal value in terms of protecting the people. So yeah, I would probably stop here.
Yeah, no, I think this actually speaks to a broader point that, the more people are starting to be employed in roles around digital data ethics, the more people are in organizations with ethics in their role, just generally. I think it opens up conversations about ethics. So it's interesting that you're raising that as well, that it's more about ethical health overall, not just what's happening in the digital ethics space. I was curious about one thing you mentioned, Sam, which was, that's the way I understood it, at least, was some of the borrowers that are doing best are some of the ones who are kind of reacting to any issues that they've identified already. And I suppose just thinking of how to engage, whether it's local borrowers or if it's any kind of organization in a digital ethics conversation because of issues that have been identified in a way that isn't making them defensive or feel, but actually just in a positive engagement. Do you have some kind of insights? Has that generally been going well? Are people quite open to this conversation now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Initially, no, they weren't open. So this is like a year and a bit ago when I joined Lottie. The conversations were sort of falling on deaf ears unless they already thought it was important. And so that's something we have worked on this year, is how do you convince people before that there's a problem, for example, that there might be a problem, but not just the negative message, what's the positive message to make people excited about doing it. And I think one of the really interesting things that actually we've built on, so in Camden Council, they've got a data charter that was created by their residents. They're currently in the process of having another panel of residents basically hold them to account what they've done in the first year from the first data charter. One of the things the data charter proposed was that Camden on their website would go out and ask residents, what do you think about how we do this or that? And one of the themes that has emerged is that residents really want them to be doing more with data. Whilst they want the data to be handled securely, they also want data to be used more and better to improve their lives. And so I think articulating that residents also have the expectation, part of ethics is delivering positive value whilst minimizing the negative risks almost. And it's a continual balancing act, especially in a space, where, and I don't know what the conclusion was of the previous panel, where regulation is simply not there, standards don't exist, there is no like common approach you can take. It doesn't exist in the world. Some really good tools exist. We don't know when best practices for when to use this tool or the other tool. So they're all going in blind. It's a learning by doing sort of thing. So, this is, I think, a really interesting point is that councils have found persuasive is that actually, this is part of our just general journey for data innovation, is being better at doing it responsibly. And I think just coming to the point others have made is, what data ethics, where does it fit in digital ethics? Well, I'd suggest it's really, in the long run, in the future, in 50 years, when everything is data processed, it's just ethics again. And so councils, public sector probably more broadly, although you might argue different areas, better or worse, are in the business of ethics through democracy. We vote on what we want to see happen. In general, we're delivering what people want us to deliver. We have an advantage. We don't have is this an advantage? I don't know. But we have an advantage in ethics, and that maybe there isn't a profit-making incentive. We just effectively want to do what is best for our residents, our citizens, in everything we do. And so that foundation, I think, is a really good starting point for the public sector to quickly catch up where the private sector has better specific processes. We have a really good ethical foundation, and actually, in almost every sort of service area in local government, staff are making ethical decisions every day about what they think is right and wrong, based on a really commonly understood set of values and principles that we've re-articulated again for data ethics, but really they're kind of the same things we always work to in the public sector.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what you were just saying around residents actually wanting councils to do more with data, it reminded me a bit of what you were saying, Arik, about your kind of the purpose of the Royal Society of trying to make sure that the technologies that can benefit the public are actually being deployed, and to do that you kind of need to make sure that there's a public consent and trust. Have you been looking at kind of, or what do you think will be the most important factors in building that kind of trust among the public?
Yes, we've done a lot of deep thinking about this, and I think with ethics what's key is having accountability. So if you look at how ethics is applied in other fields, medicine, accountancy, I used to be an accountant, and when we did, the way we looked at ethics was every module that we studied, there would be a 20% ethics aspect to it, and if you do anything unethical, you get struck off and you can't practice, right? And the same in medicine. We don't have something like that in the tech sector. The Royal Society has previously put out recommendations for a data science certification that's recognised across the public sector, and there was a launch of this a few months ago called the Alliance for Data Science Professionals, which is one way of starting to embed some of these ideas across the public sector. You also need so regulation on its own doesn't really solve anything. If it did, we wouldn't have murders, we wouldn't have theft, because there are regulations against all of those things, right? You need to also look at education. You need to look at what technologies can actually embed some of these ethical principles. So we're looking at the society at privacy-enhancing technologies, which are ways of making the most out of useful data sets without needing to necessarily share sensitive data or access sensitive data, or share it with private companies perhaps that the public don't want their data being shared with. So we need to look at those sorts of technologies as well, and how do we actually practically achieve some of this stuff. I think in the public sector as well, there's a broader question around fragmentation. So at the moment, everyone's doing their own thing, and my experience as a councillor is even every council is doing its own thing. If you want to park your car anywhere in England anyway, there will be like 5 or 6 different car parking apps, and that doesn't necessarily make the most of technology. What makes technology exciting is scale, doing things at scale, and at the moment we have complete fragmentation in terms of ethical standards, in terms of types of data being collected, types of data being shared nationally. I think there's an interesting ethical question to be had about centralization of data in the public sector. That's also something we might also be looking at as well.
Thanks. And I guess for you, Callum, if you have any reflections also, for this fragmentation also means that some will probably be more ahead than others in their like approaches to data ethics. And I suppose also just when you're looking at the tools that the ODI have created, the canvas, and are you seeing kind of like some organizations or areas of the public sector that you think are a bit more kind of advanced, thinking more about digital or data ethics specifically?
Yeah, I'm not really in the sort of process of naming and shaming.
No.
But yeah, no, certainly. I think it's more a case that from the work that we've done and the departments and the authorities that we've worked with, then you always unearth, these pockets of both interest and passion for data ethics. So I think it exists everywhere. Some places are just better at nurturing that at the moment, and they're better equipped. They have leaders who are more kind of bought into the process. So I would say that, yeah, there's certainly some organizations that are further ahead, but it's kind of going back to some of the discussion that we were having earlier about journeys. They're all very much at different stages, and particularly when you then expand that out to consideration of the broader digital ethics, then I think Kevin will be able to sort of speak to that about how there was a range of different progression through these different elements of digital ethics that were observed during the research. But if you don't mind, I'd like to come back to some of the earlier points that were made by Erika and Sam actually as well, regarding citizens being interested in their data being used for kind of beneficial purposes. It's really interesting as well. Erika and I were just chatting before this about privacy-enhancing technologies, which we're also doing research on at the ODI. And we found through this as well that while there might be these privacy guarantees, well, debatable in some instances, but nonetheless, we're finding that people are actually interested not just in their privacy being maintained, but then also the value that's being generated, whether that's through federated learning, contributing to an eventual model, just because their privacy hasn't necessarily been undermined or what have you, then it's going beyond that now. And I think it speaks to this greater understanding or greater acknowledgement by the public of issues to do with data privacy. So these are beginning to kind of settle in as well. And then it's thinking about what's going to be the next kind of criteria that we need to be meeting when we're actually thinking about ethically dealing with data about people. So, yeah.
So, like, not only privacy anymore. It's much more complex in the questions about data.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions I would like to ask, but I also want to make sure that we leave time if anyone either in the room or online, of course, who can submit through the Q&A button, have any questions, then we can bring a mic. Yes, we have a question here at the front. Could my mic holding colleagues? Thanks, Susanne. Yeah, here, Ben.
Hi, Ben Hawes. I'm a tech policy consultant. This point about getting public value, positive value from data. Will we actually want to start giving public bodies positive duties to gain value from data for the public? And I say this because, for a start, it's difficult to build capability in something in the public sector if you can't point to it in your duties. That's one thing. But we have an agency gap. The law gives individuals only limited powers, only related to privacy. And that leaves companies acting in the interests of companies, individuals unable to act at any scale. Who, if not the public sector, in an increasingly datafied world, acts for the collective public interest? And as it is, still most of the data duties the public bodies had are negative ones. They're not to do things and not to do things wrong. And we're in a world where we actually probably want public sector bodies to go out and trade for access to data held by private companies, act positively, not just negatively. Will we actually will we want to give public bodies those actual legal duties?
I don't know. Do you want to come in on this, Kevin?
I can make a start on it, but I'm sure others have got thoughts as well. It's a really interesting idea, Ben. Firstly, picking up on Sam's point, which he reiterated, yes, ethics is so often seen as just avoiding the negative, just as risk mitigation, whereas that's not the case. It's also about benefiting people. Again, what sort of society do we want in the long run? I think we've seen, again, going back to our interviews, some departments saying they were looking to Cabinet Office to give them direction because they didn't want to go down this sort of siloed approach of everyone creating their own rules, their own approaches, which could then be in conflict potentially with each other. I mean, certainly from our perspective, one of the things we're recommending is seeing developing the ethics culture that Michaela was talking about through people's OKRs, through objectives, through getting that into the workforce, getting that into the mentality in the workforce there. Whether I go so far as to make it a legal duty, I think that probably goes a little bit beyond my remit. But I think it's an interesting and provocative statement to put out there.
Michaela, I was wondering if you wanted to come in on like the data ethics, not just, as we said, from kind of avoiding negatives, but also using data for positives. Is that something that you're looking at as well?
So I guess one thing I could mention is that there is thinking at this point, really just thinking in that area of things like ethical certification or things like that, where we kind of use existing models. So, where you have something like Athena, Swan, and whatnot, kind of organizations striving to achieve a certain level that then they can kind of display that they meet it, and that having some benefits in terms of, I don't know, attracting employees or so on. So kind of trying to rework that model and use it as a sort of stamp of this is an ethical organization that deals with data ethically. That on itself, I would say, has a potential to be beneficial and a potential to turn into a problematic thing by going back to that compliance. So I think that here it's almost like an arms race between that negative and positive motivation, because the more we try to create those kind of systemic solutions where as a private sector, sort of public sector, we give that incentive, the more it can kind of be flipped on its back and go like, but if I do this, then I get some benefit. So it's going to turn into a sort of tick boxing exercise, if you see what I mean. So I would go back to what Kevin said and kind of stick by my point that a lot of that positive motion in changing that mindset, whether it's individuals or the ways we work as an organization. And so if you consider our end of last century and still stay with us, kind of institutional racism, whatever, not it's about that change within. So it's the change, it's unfortunately quite slow, but I think that's the most reliable tool we have. That's kind of that societal almost expectation rather than a legal duty. And coming back to what Arik said, legislation, it's a good thing, but
Sorry, we're having some connection issues. I think we're picking up on most of your points, but maybe I'll just have to interrupt you there for now. Sorry about that. But I think it's a good point around whether we are looking at how to kind of transform the organizations culturally, or whether it's legal duties, and perhaps more of a preference here for an overall kind of approach to the whole mindset. Any other questions either in the room or from online for the time being? If not, I'm also very curious to hear from the panel on any examples you've seen. I mean, we've kind of talked about whether any areas were more progressed than others, but also any specifics from like international practice where any public sector organizations, and not to put you on the spot, Sam, but I know you mentioned Amsterdam a little bit before, some of the practices and the employment of data ethicists in other cities across the world. I was just wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit of what you know of that, or anyone else. It could be in the UK, just specific things where you've seen it and you've thought, actually, that's quite like either innovative or just forward-thinking in some ways.
Yeah, sure. So I'll mention a couple of examples from the Netherlands, but first on the employment of a data ethicist. So Lottie, we have a toolkit of recommendations for developing capabilities in organizations, and that's the last thing we suggest doing, because we don't want you to delegate it to one person. We think it should be something everyone's doing. But if you're an organization, so we serve 25 boroughs, we thought, okay, probably is room for someone to do some dedicated thinking on that. But a single borough, we think if everyone employed a data ethicist in the UK, if you're a local government, there's not enough in the country for that, so it's not going to work. So just on that one, we don't think necessarily it's like the right thing for a local authority to do. But in terms of good practice from abroad, so I think one thing that probably a lot of people have seen in Amsterdam is they have their algorithm register, which Helsinki and Amsterdam both launched at the same time. It's actually, I've got a little bit of inside track on that. They say that was a pilot, and then in the next month or so, they're releasing another 100 plus examples of algorithms from use in the public sector there. So that's sort of, the pilot was run, and they've done the learning, they've done the reflections, and they're at a point where they're developing common standards and getting to a place there that just we are not at in the UK. And then they're now sort of bringing it out, so it's embedding across organizations, wider public sector. And in that case, the country, the Netherlands as a whole, want to do an algorithm register, but they're now taking the lead from Amsterdam because they've got really ahead of the game there. So that's a really good example, I think, and just they're so much more advanced in their thinking. And you can see in the UK we have the algorithmic transparency standard here, which we really like in Lottie, and we're helping develop that out, but they're just a bit further ahead there, and really they've embedded it wide across their organization. The other thing in local government, obviously, is this big smart city agenda, having sensors everywhere, basically, in public, and we don't have many good standards around that in the UK. And in the Netherlands, there's actually a coalition of cities at the moment who are trying to develop standards for that. In particular, for us, there's big questions around procurement. So what are the technologies you're procuring? How are you able to audit them? What are the standards you should be holding suppliers to? There's probably a secondary question, because you probably need to have your own standards for yourselves that no one has either. So you probably have to quickly do that bit and then get onto this bit. But they're able to have that conversation in the Netherlands. So that's probably one where, I'll be honest, in the UK we'll probably just be looking and learning from them there. But I think it's the ODI, they have a data ethics maturity model for organizations, which we use. And I would suggest everyone in the UK is level 1 or maybe 3 or 4, 2. And then Amsterdam maybe got to 3. And that's a big deal in this model. So I think there's a lot of learning we could do abroad, and they're one of the places for sure.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. From the research that you've been conducting, were there any kind of examples that were standing out for you, either here in the UK or abroad?
There have been a few in the UK, particularly around, well, two things I would say. Firstly, some departments have been developing their own ethics committees. So when you have internal issues that get raised and say, okay, is there an ethical issue with this? There's a committee to go to and run that through a group of people. In my other life as an academic, I've run numerous research ethics committees at universities, which essentially function in the same purpose. You want to do some research, take it to the committee. They will tell you how to do it better. I'm pausing here slightly because this gets into another area about ethics is often seen as a blocker. And I think there are often people who have problems with ethics committees because they're seen as blockers to practice happening. In actual fact, we prefer, and I trust most people here would agree, that ethics is an enabler because it helps to de-risk problems, it helps to make sure that what you are doing is good, it then becomes sustainable, you're not going to run into problems down the road, and so on. So I think we have seen some. What we've seen with those ethics committees is that they don't yet function in a sort of compulsory or mandatory way. So it becomes very much a matter of, well, if you know somebody who's on the committee, you know about the committee, and then you will go through it. But a lot of other people have never even heard of the committee within the department. The other big thing, this comes back to a point that Sam made about democratization of ethics, is those departments that already have good relationships or that engage regularly with the public are doing a good job at stakeholder engagement, getting out there and saying, okay, what are the issues, what are the problems that you're facing, and taking that on board. For departments that have less of a public face, they're doing less of that stakeholder engagement, and I think that really needs to change as well, because if you're in government and you're not affecting the public, then something seems to be wrong. I would also say if you're in technology and that's not affecting people, there's something seems to be wrong. You know, ethics is at the heart of government, it's at the heart of technology. And so, as I say, there are departments going out and doing that, and that's been really successful where we've seen it.
Thank you. And I guess that kind of question around public engagement to build greater trust, is that something that you've seen some like council, Sam, just coming to you when you work with local authorities, because I guess that's part of the public sector that's quite close to the residents or the people that they're affecting?
Yeah, I think, so Camden's data charter led the way, so they worked with Involve, who are they sort of lead on citizen assembly things, and they ran to citizen assembly to create their data charter. And actually, I'll tee up Michaela, because I think she might have something to say similar for Scotland in a second. But I'll just quickly add there's an initiative that we're launching next year with the Mayor of London, with the Alan Turing Institute, plus anyone who would like to be involved. The working name is London Data Week. The purpose is to take the conversations around what we think the future of data and data technology should look like, take that conversation and make it a public-driven, resident-driven one. So anyone who wants to engage with the public, if you're the classic stakeholders who normally drive innovation, let's take a step back. Let's enable conversations amongst the public. You know, everyone was saying during COVID, let's have this societal conversation around data. Okay, so we're going to try and do that next summer. So we've got Newham very keen on this. Lots of local authorities involved, you know, different people, different organisations involved. So if anyone is interested on that, please do reach out. You can find my email literally all over the Lottie website. Can you give me like a week, because I've got a deadline soon as well. But so we're trying to sort of foster that on a higher level, but I think it is something that we're seeing more commonly, and actually I would say it's one thing the UK is actually really good on in data ethics space, is being like led through public engagement mechanisms.
Oh, that's great. That's great news when we get a low ranking before. So I think we have one question. No, but I also just wanted to hear from Michaela on when you were just being teed up from Sam on any projects you have coming up, and hopefully the connection is a bit better. I think it should be working now.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. So in Scottish Government, we are now running a public panel on the use of public sector data, and you know there's been quite a number of these, obviously, and there's loads of research already. So what we try to do is to do a bit different setting. So essentially, we dedicate about 4 sessions to the citizen panel, exploring their own, you know, kind of thoughts on past projects and forming principles based on those. And then we have 4 sessions where the participants can actually test their own principles on different data projects. And that comes back to what Eric said, that, you know, that in different projects, different considerations will arise. So what we really want to try and achieve here is to, I mean, it's not quite co-creation, but it's trying to get the people not only to give us the stimulus and, you know, this is what I'd like to see, but work with them to tease out those particularities of different projects, different applications, and not just in terms of the data, but in terms of the situation as well. So, you know, is it a proactive measure? Is it a reactive measure? And so on. So, you know, this is a project that's currently undergoing, and we want to, at the back of it, also explore whether we could set up a standing panel that we could go to with sort of ethical data questions that we want to explore with citizens to raise that trust and transparency. So yeah, if anyone would like to, you know, read more about it or hear more about it, I'd be delighted to, you know, take any questions via email, which you can you know, find also, or LinkedIn. Get in touch. I'd love to speak about that.
That's great. And we actually come to we need to wrap up now. So I think that's great to end with an invitation for London Data Week next year, and also to engage with this exciting new work in the Scottish Government to engage the public. And so with that, I think if you could just all join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much. And just to say, the next plenary session will be starting in here in about 10 minutes. It will be on how we can learn from mistakes and whether that can help us increase public trust. But there's just like a little break if you need to nip out for a coffee or anything. But thank you very much, and see you shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you.